So this is going to be less of a top 10 and more just me selecting 10 units which are ranging from bad to almost comedically bad. The sort of units that you pick when you either have no more money or you want to go for a very quantity approach to your army. These units honestly are really the sort of thing where you're really going to be scraping the barrel. None of them are particularly fantastic. So I'm not really sure how I would categorize them because they're all pretty terrible, so I'm just going to list them as opposed to saying which ones are worse, and you can sort of piece together yourself whether you think certain units are worse than others, because it's a mix of archers and infantry. There's no cavalry on this list because all cavalry can potentially do a fair amount of damage and can pretty easily pay for itself if you use it well. These units on the other hand are something that it's very difficult for them to achieve anything meaningful in a battle other than just be cannon fodder. So we'll list through them, and well, it will become quite obvious why these units are here. And there may be a few units as well out of these that aren't on this list of 10 that maybe deserve to be, because every faction has got their trash, but these were the units that I felt were the trashiest of the trash. So we'll start off with the archers and shift into the infantry, and we'll point and laugh. So the Goblin trackers are not comedically awful, but they are still pretty shocking in terms of how effective they actually are. 5 attack, 3 defense and 3 charge are the kind of stats you would expect to see from a unit that is definitely not designed to go into any kind of melee combat. However, their ranged potency is also lacking somewhat because their missile damage is only 5. Now, archers can be useful, even an archer like this, provided you can keep them out of harm's way, but the problem with most of the low tier archers is they can be so easily shredded in a skirmish fight that it's almost not worth bringing them unless you have really nothing better to spend your money on. What slightly saves them from being comedically bad is the fact they can deploy stakes, so they can at least be something to ward off cavalry from a particular direction. However, other than that, the Goblin trackers are not particularly fantastic, and it is really indicative of Gundabad in general. They are not a ranged focused faction at all. They really only have one decent archer, and this is not it. The Goblin trackers, ironically, in vanilla were Gundabad's best archer. This is not the case anymore, and thank God for that, because they are pretty darn terrible. It was really a choice between these guys or the scouts who made it here, and the scouts at least had a slightly higher missile score of 6, but the Goblin trackers are slightly better in melee, but then you should not really be ever using these guys in melee, or at least not depending on them in melee. You can certainly use them as a sort of meat shield, I suppose, if you have no other option in the late game, but really it's not great. I mean, you could argue that every archer deserves to be above a lot of the militia tier units because their range is still useful, but I figured I would get a bit of variety on the units that are bad, and in terms of relative power, enemy archers are going to utterly devastate this unit. So there are going to be more archers, however, archers that are worse than this even, so we should move on to them, I think. The Hobbit Archers are not only a terrible unit in and of themselves, but they also have the misfortune of being a part of Arnor, whose archer force is arguably the strongest in the game. It's pretty arguable at that point, but there is literally no reason I can ever envisage the Hobbit Archers being an integral part of Arnor's army, and I can't see why you'd ever pick them, to be honest with you. Even if you wanted the comedy of having hobbits running around, Band of Brass Archers are much superior to these guys. They have 3 attack, 0 defense, and 2 charge. They do have 6 missile damage, to be fair, and they can hide anywhere, but 0 defense. Like, what? Like, you can see why. I mean, they're not exactly dressed for the battlefield, but 0 defense. I mean, they're just asking to be shot to death, and really, a part of this is also the fact that you're never going to use them. I mean, even Eriador have got archers that are much better than this, a very extensive archer collection. And the Hobbit Archers are at the bottom of this, and there's no reason you would ever use them. At least the Goblin trackers, you can say that Gundabad's infantry takes priority, and perhaps you still want an archer force, so maybe you'll still use the Goblin trackers. They'll still largely be not very useful unless they're shooting very low tier units, but really the Hobbit Archers are going to be so dreadful in a skirmish fight. And when it comes to a melee fight, 0 defense means they're going to be chopped to pieces with impunity even by the lowest tier of unit. They're going to die in one hit to basically anything. So, yeah, I mean, there's some officers here. There's a few battle-ready Dunedains to try and stave off the pain, but other than that, the Hobbit Archers are pretty awful. They are, however, not the worst archer. We shall move on to the worst archer now. Alas, when it comes to creatures that perhaps should not be on the battlefield, the Snaga outrank even the Hobbits in most situations, especially when it comes to archery. The Snaga archers are almost insultingly awful, to be fair. I can't see why you'd ever want to use them. Again, they're very similar to the Hobbits in the sense they have 3 attack, 0 defense and 2 charge, so in melee they will basically be exactly the same as one another. They can also hide anywhere, but they have 5 missile damage, so as archers they perform the job even worse. Why? Why would you ever use them? I mean, the Snaga in general are the butt of many jokes, but the Snaga archers in my opinion are the worst of the Snaga. The Snaga javelins really are the one Snaga unit I would suggest are actually useful. They can potentially do a fair amount of damage if you use them correctly to the right units. The archers, on the other hand, you know, you could argue that yes, they could deal some damage to lower tier units, but you'd need to kill an awful lot of lower tier units, I think, to make it worth bringing them, as opposed to another unit that would do a better job. Especially seeing as they're a part of Gundabad. I mean, come on. Really? I don't know. I mean, nothing I can say is adequate for the stats that these guys bring to the table. Again, 0 defense. I mean, nothing will be quite as awful as 0 defense in the future. Like, you know, I can't think of any other units other than this and the Hobbit Archers that have a stat at 0. But, you know, we shall see. I think maybe the Barrow Whites are a different matter, like a different kettle of fish, really, because they are designed for something completely different. But the Snaga Archers really have no excuse. I don't know really what to say about them. They are plain awful and definitely the worst archer in the game. Now we shall move on to some of the low tier militia units, and probably mathematically the worst units in the game. So let's take a look at some of the worst melee units you can muster. Now the Dunman Clansmen are probably the one melee unit on this list which isn't utterly awful. Some of them don't have shields, I've noticed, but they do have something going for them. It's not their stats. 5 attack, 7 defense, and 2 charge for a melee unit is very awful. They're not going to be getting tons and tons of kills for you. They can form Skill Trom and a good versus Cav, though. So Skill Trom is really the one thing that really makes them worth it. It means you can, maybe in a defensive siege, get enemy units caught on them for a while you fall back and reform. The good versus Cav is nice, but ultimately it's not really going to be too useful because an enemy cav charge is going to flatten these guys in no time at all. If you can somehow entrap cavalry with these guys, they may well do a bit of damage, but ultimately their stats are so low that it's not going to make a great deal of difference. Like, it is preferable to most other militia tier units which are not good versus cav, but even so, their stats are so low that it doesn't really matter. Another saving grace for them is that they are cheap, as they should be. Most units, well, every unit on this collection is going to be very cheap. Only 100 florins, so if you're spending a lot of money as Isengard and just want to fill out your army, these guys are not a terrible pick. I've used them before. And they can fulfill the role of just bogging enemy units down admirably enough, but then most militia can. Really, their garbage stats are what puts them here. Everything else they are at least better than everything else in terms of melee on this list, though, because of their attributes. We should, however, move along, I believe, and we'll move along to some orcs, you'll be unsurprised to hear. Well, actually I lied. We're moving on to the Haradrim Spearmen, and this is a unit, again, that's been left over from vanilla. There are a lot of vanilla units on this list, a lot of the vanilla low tier units. And the Haradrim Spears are essentially the same as the Dunman Clansmen. They can form Skill Trom and the good versus Cav as well. The only difference is they have 1 point more in attack and 1 point less in defense, and they have 1 more charge. I mean 3 charge. You're never going to be charging with this unit all that much, but really 1 point less in defense makes them worse in many ways, because the only function of most militia units is to bog down the enemy. So lessening their ability to do that makes them slightly worse. You could argue that 1 point more in attack means they'll be slightly better at taking out cav, but it's not really all that much better. Again, they're going to get flattened by cav charges. And ultimately, one thing that makes them worse as well is the fact that Harad have always had an extensive spear and polearm collection, and the Haradrim spearmen have always found themselves at the bottom of that. So there really is no real reason to use them other than the fact that you've run out of money. And even then, I would suggest that you should probably go for the Haradrim Archers. I mean, they're garbage, yes, just in the same way that the other archers on this list were garbage. They only narrowly missed out on that. But they can at least do some damage at range and can deploy stakes. These guys will get flattened by a cav charge from the front most of the time. And, yeah, I mean, there's really no reason to pick these guys. You'd be much better off picking the South-Run Warband. I don't really understand why they were ever a thing, to be honest with you. The Haradrim Spears have always been utterly garbage. There's never really been any reason to pick them because of Harad's spear collection, at least with the Dunland Clansmen. Isengard have been much more about their pikes other than their sort of shielded spears. I don't know. I mean, their outfit is certainly not really designed for an attrition-based warfare either. The sort of garb. Yeah, not great. Not great at all. But they are by no means the worst infantry unit. You know, we'll get to the worst. In fact, we should now move on to the Orcs proper. The Goblin Infantry has always been a very, very poor melee infantry unit. They can't form Skiltron unlike the previous two melee units, which means they fulfill their role as cannon fodder even worse. But they do at least have better stats, but then 8 attack, 7 defense and 4 charge is not exactly stats that is going to win you any battles. They really are just designed to bog down the enemy. The Misty Mountains units in general will deal slightly more damage than you might expect, but ultimately these guys are still utter trash. They can hide anywhere, so I mean, that's something. But again, the ability to hide is not really very useful for melee infantry. I would suggest that for archers it would be slightly more useful, but the way Medieval 2 has always worked, hiding has always been a little bit more... Well, ambushes in general have been a little bit more difficult to pull off than they've been in the more recent Total War titles. And even if you could, what sort of ambush would it be if it's made out of Goblin Infantry? You could charge into the back of an elite unit and it would do literally nothing. You know, it's gonna... just awful, really. It's not a good unit. I would suggest that the Goblin Infantry is... Well, I mean, it's cheap, but the Misty Mountains, they don't really have much of an issue in terms of filling out their army with slightly better units. I mean, even if you put the Blackback Berserkers in there and the Blackwatch Legion in there, you're still going to have money left over for heavy Goblin Infantry and, you know, Mountain Uruk Blades. So, really, I'm questioning why you would ever want to use these guys. It's a conundrum, to be sure, but, you know, they're not the only Goblin unit that I would see as largely defunct. We'll move on to another one right now. Now, the Goblin Band can form Skiltron, unlike the Goblin Infantry of the Misty Mountains, but 6 attack, 6 defense, and 3 charge, you know, very familiar stat levels that we're talking about with regards to all these units. They're very low. However, they are not good versus cav, so they're essentially worse than the Haradrim Spears and the Dunland Clansmen. And really, everything I said about them applies to these guys as well. I mean, they're just ultimately very, very bad units. And I mean, you can picture the Orcs using these units to just fill out their armies, but when it comes to Gundabad and the Misty Mountains, I can't see anyone using these guys unless they were utterly free. You know, and that's the problem I can see with them. You know, it's easy enough with the Misty Mountains and Gundabad to actually build an army that's well priced and that doesn't have these units that I would deem as useless in most situations. Like, this is a unit that if you were defending as Gundabad, maybe you could use it as something to cover your retreat, like the Dunland Clansmen. But other than that, I can't see any use for them. You know, they're gonna get themselves utterly shredded in a field battle by cav and by archers, and even if it just comes down to a melee fight, what are they gonna kill? You know, maybe they'll get 10 or so kills against a unit of Arnor militia. But other than that, they're going to be next to useless. So, I don't know. I think that a lot of these units should be free, to be honest with you. And there is a precedent for that, which we'll get onto a little bit later on. But yes, the low tier goblins, unsurprisingly, are part of the trashiest units in the game. Now, we couldn't have a list of the worst units in 3rd Age without mentioning the Naga Stalkers, could we? They're by no means the worst unit in the game, which obviously means they're OP and should be nerfed, but really, their stats are not fantastic. I mean, 6 attack, 8 defense and 5 charge is not awful, but, well, at least not next to some of the other units on this list, but they don't really have anything special about them. They can't form Skilltron. As we've seen before, though, if there are enough of them, they can eventually overwhelm the mightiest units like the Mithril Guard, but really, unfortunately for the Snaga, it's a very rare situation in which they are pitched against one Mithril Guard while they have a full stack. Usually in a field battle they will have to contend with, dare I say it, cavalry, or archers, or even more than one infantry unit at a time, all of which the Naga Stalkers struggle a little bit with. A little bit might be a bit of an understatement, but yes. I have a special place in my heart for the Naga Stalkers, to be honest with you, but I cannot deny that they are garbage. The lowest tier of garbage, but they are not the worst of the worst, it must be said. We should move on to the worst of the worst, I think, actually. And, well, there are really 2 units that take home the prize for being utterly worthless. Now, when you're denoted by the name Fodder, you don't expect anything too special, and the Orc Fodder indeed are nothing special. 4 attack, 9 defense and 2 charge is not terrible, I suppose, and they have the ability to deploy stakes, so, I mean, they're not bad. Indeed, you could even view them as better than some of the units on this list, but interestingly enough, they are also free, so that means that they do actually have some sort of utility for Mordor. If you have 3 spare slots at the end of your army with no money to spend, you can then fill it out, these guys. And that really, I think, is the key to most of these bargain basement units, so to speak. There's really no reason not to use the Orc Fodder if you have no money left, because they are totally free, and I feel like some of the Goblin units like the Goblin Band and the Goblin Infantry can learn a thing or two from the Orc Fodder. It would give them a reason to be used. Other than that, I can't see them ever being used. So the Orc Fodder is actually kind of useful, despite the comedy of them being free, and the fact that they will be utterly slaughtered in melee by basically everything. What can you say about the Orc Fodder? I mean, it's a very Mordor thing indeed to have your units be free, and just very sacrificial, but there are a lot of them, so if you surround your more elite units with these guys, that's really what Mordor is all about, so there's nothing really to complain about. I mean, you can't complain when you spend nothing on a unit, but just bear in mind that they will be put in the ground very easily by most everything. There is, however, one unit that I would describe as actually being worse than the Orc Fodder in melee, and, well, we'll move on to them, shall we? Now, you would expect that a unit that can potentially be good versus cav, and can deploy stakes, and can hide anywhere would be thought of a little bit more fondly than the likes of Orc Fodder, which is literally designed to die on the battlefield to protect your better units. However, the Hobbit Archers has got a much more serious problem, and that is its laughable melee stats of 3 attack, 1 defense, and 3 charge. Now yes, the Hobbit Archers and the Naga Archers have got worse stats in melee, but they are also an archer unit. They at least can do damage from range. These guys are a melee unit. They are designed to fight in melee, at least that's the idea behind them, I assume. I'm just staggered these guys cost money at all at 100 florins. I mean, even that's a bit of a rip-off, to be honest with you. They really should be free, let's be honest. There's no other reason to use them. I mean, I have no words to describe how truly terrible this unit is. They're going to be utterly shredded to bits by enemy archers. They're going to be destroyed on cav charges, and they are also probably the worst unit in the game in sustained melee, simply because of that 1 defense. I mean, what are they going to be? What are these guys for? I mean, I know that they're hobbits, and I know that they're basically just farmers, but seriously? Why are they on the battlefield? They may as well just fall on their own spears. It's bad. It's bad, and in my opinion, this is the worst unit in the game. Worse than the Orc Fodder. Worse even than the 2 archer units that have got similar stats in melee to them, because at least they've got they've got some sort of ranged presence. Yes, they will lose a skirmish fight very, very easily, but at least they can do some damage at range. These guys are going to be mostly dead by the time they reach the enemy lines, and then they're going to break immediately because of how awful they are. I don't know, at least they've got some battle-ready Dunedain over here as officers. But other than that, you know, yeah, not fantastic. And that was a little painful waltz through the lowest depths of the units of this game. Again, this was not really a particularly scientific list. This isn't even really a top 10, this is just a collection. You can sort them out how you will, to be honest with you, because it doesn't really matter. They're all terrible. And, yeah, well, next up will be a much more useful list, I feel, with the top 10 heavy infantry, one of the more central parts. Heavy infantry is not the strongest part of your army anymore, like it was in vanilla, I fear, but it is still a very central part, and you know, you can get ready for dwarven domination when it comes to that. And yeah, the heavy infantry will be a much more comprehensive list, and I will actually have to do a little bit more testing other than just looking at the stats and laughing. So I hope you enjoyed this, however awful the units were on it, and I hope you'll join me for the top 10 heavy infantry. And I want to do a few more sieges and scenarios in the future as well, so I hope you'll join me for those as well.